Composition is something it just takes time to build. Each small decision builds up over time. And if you kind of build all of your musical elements in the piece to complement that central idea, then you can much more easily make something that really hangs together as a finished piece.
I want to welcome everybody. This is Theodore Schwamm. He's one of my members in the Composer's Brain community. You've been a member since how long? How long have you been a member?
I think right at the start of July of 2024.
July of 2024. Cool. And what were you doing before that time?
So I had just graduated from Kenyon College. I was a music major there. It's a small liberal arts college in Ohio. Because of that, I had a lot of flexibility in how I kind of constructed my major. And my two focuses were vocal performance and composition.
And what's your voice type?
I'm a tenor.
Cool. So
hmm
you went to college, it was liberal arts college, and you went in there knowing you were going to do music from the beginning?
Knowing I was going to do music, not sure exactly how that was going to fit into what I was doing. I think, like a lot of kids going into college, I had a bunch of interests. I remember during the application period, people asked me what I was thinking about doing. I'd be like, well, I'm going to one of these 7 schools probably and doing something with math, theater, physics, or music. Really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Basically, as soon as class registration came around for that first semester, I looked at the classes and I was trying to figure out what was most interesting to me, and it was all music classes. I just wanted to take music. So pretty much after that was when I figured out, hey, music's going to be my major. It's going to be kind of my main focus.
So you didn't go into college. It's interesting. You didn't go into your undergrad knowing 100% you would do something with music. You were always
Yeah.
interested in it,
hmm
obviously a lot, but you didn't know if you would pursue it as a major until you pretty much got there.
hmm
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What were some of the classes that you were taking as an undergrad? Like your favorite classes?
Oh, well, we can maybe talk more about this in a bit, but music theory, just the first level music theory,
Yeah.
was the class that got me into composition. After that point, throughout the rest of my time at Kenyon, we have a class that's kind of theory 3, counterpoint, form, all of that stuff, but has more stuff incorporated into that. It's one of the hardest classes I took during college and definitely a favorite. Jazz theory was also a great class. I took that my last semester. Conducting seminar is also up there. So generally the theory classes and things that align also with my interest in the choral music world.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. When you joined our community, it was interesting because you already had a couple of choral things lined up, and right now you're writing a lot of choral music and vocal
hmm
music and things like that. And I find that quite interesting to focus on such a kind of, let's say, niche, for lack of a better term, because you're really focused on, okay, how do I set text? How do I write for the voice? How do I write for one voice, which is different than writing for multiple voices? Because that's like a lifetime in of itself to write for the choir and to write for voices. So I thought that was an interesting thing about you. I want to actually play, just to get us started with some music, I want to play the first couple minutes of your piece, Spring Morning from 2023. And this is a piece, can you describe a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, so one of my mentors at my school let me know that there was a composition competition he'd heard about happening at Case Western. He encouraged me to, write something for it during the summer of 2023, and I, had some time. I decided, hey, I'm going to do this. I haven't written a choral piece before, but I've sung in choirs since I was 13. So I had a lot of choral background, and I decided to dive into that world basically. And this is the piece that resulted from that.
Cool. So let's listen to the first 2 minutes of Spring Morning.
I don't quite know. Down to the stream where the king comes from. Where on the hill where the pine trees grow. Anywhere, anywhere. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Where am I going? The clouds sail by. Little ones, baby ones, over the sky. Where am I going? The shadows pass. Little ones, baby ones, over the grass. Over the grass. Over the grass. Over the grass. Where am I going? I don't quite know. Where am I going? I don't quite know. Down to the stream where the king comes from. Well, on the hill where the pine trees grow. Anywhere, anywhere. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. You have said kingcups grow, up on the hill where the pine trees grow. Anywhere, anywhere, I don't know. Anywhere, anywhere, I don't know. Where am I going? The high will stop. Anywhere, anywhere, I don't know. It's awful fun to be born at all. Anywhere, anywhere, I don't know. Where am I going? The ring does screw. Anywhere, anywhere. We do have beautiful things to do. 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 Where am I going? I don't quite know. Where am I going? I don't quite know. Down to the stream where the kingcups grow, up on the hill where the pine trees grow. Anywhere, anywhere, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. If you were a you'd lean on the wind where your lifting bar. You'd say to the wind that it took you away. That's where I wanted to go today. Go today. Go today. Go today. Go.
So I remember this was the first piece I think you showed during office hours, right? Is that
I'm pretty
correct?
sure.
Am I right?
Yeah.
I think it was one of the first pieces you showed. And for me, what I was struck by was how motivically tight it was with this like eighth double 16th motive that kept going on through, and how you weren't afraid to really develop that idea. I thought that was really interesting, especially throughout these first couple of minutes in the piece. When you're setting text, like how do you actually do it? Like what's your strategy for setting text?
It's definitely evolved over time. Something that has stayed a key part of my process is picking a text that I have a musical idea about. I think there are some texts that work really well when you read them, but they don't work well when you hear them, and they wouldn't work well set to music. My grandfather is a professor of English, and he's always said that he hates when people set Shakespeare, particularly sonnets. He just feels like nobody can translate the iambic pentameter well into
Yeah.
music. So, but I mean, because of that, I've never looked at setting Shakespeare. Yeah,
I remember that
beyond
was
that.
something that was brought up actually in one of our classes.
Hmm.
One of our members said, you know, I'm having trouble because the poem is in iambic pentameter, ba 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 ba, and I can't help but think of it that way, like the 6/8 kind of pattern, da quarter eighth, quarter eighth, quarter eighth. And I remember one thing that we talked about was don't feel that you have to be married to the stresses that the original poet did. But when the original poet is Shakespeare and is so famous, and you're used to hearing it that way, it becomes kind of a problem, right?
Yeah, people have their own conception of the poem already coming
Yeah.
into it. And, you know, the musical idea that I feel like I need to have to work with a poem, it started out being a rhythmic idea. And certainly that's the case for Spring Morning, that where am I going, I don't quite know. As soon as I read it, while I was kind of trawling my resources for poems that I was interested in, I was like, I can hear this rhythmic pulse to just the poem as a piece that I can read out loud. And I think that will translate really well to music. In more recent pieces that I've done, both in the kind of art song world and the choral world, it isn't necessarily a rhythm that I hear right away. It might be kind of a harmonic color, an image that I feel like is very evocative that I'd want to express musically. Might be a melody. Really, any of the parameters we can end up playing with as composers might come to mind as I'm kind of looking into poems and thinking about, hey, do I want to set this in a piece or not? Though I do feel like I have to consider the rhythm first as I'm developing a piece.
What you just said was really interesting because with this particular piece, your in was rhythm. The way that you even say, where am I going? Just even me saying that, where am I going? I naturally also did the eighth double 16th thing. Where
Hmm.
am I going? Da, 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 right? Eighth double 16th and 16th on the next beat, which is kind of the natural way of saying those things. So that to me is an in, rhythmic in. But then you're also talking about, okay, I'm looking at a poem and there might be a melodic in, a melodic way to first think about writing a piece of music rather than a rhythmic way. So I'm curious, what is there a piece that you worked on or are working on right now where you had a more melodic engagement with the material first before a rhythmic one?
My piece that I'm actively working on right now kind of had a split focus as I was starting to develop it. It's a poem by Marion Strobel. It actually is also called Spring Morning, coincidentally. But I read it
What's
and
gonna happen when
I know I'm
when
gonna run out
summer
of
rolls
spring morning
around?
poems.
What happens when a new season rolls around? Are you gonna stop writing?
I don't know. We'll have to see. Or I'll just keep writing music to spring morning poems until
It's
I
it's
run out of them.
it's a winter time right now, so hopefully you're still feeling
hmm
inspired, though it's not
Yeah.
spring.
No, I that piece was I had a rhythmic idea and a melodic idea kind of separate from one another and then
Okay.
combined them very early in the process.
Okay. Is this the piece? Oh, is this the piece you're working on right now, the
Yeah,
choral
this is
piece?
O'Day. I figured
Okay,
I'd,
cool.
change the name so it wasn't two different spring morning choir pieces, but it works for what I'm doing with it.
I'm gonna pull this up on I'm actually gonna share my screen here actually, because that way we can really follow along with what you're doing here. I've never done this on the podcast, actually, sharing a work in progress, but I think it would be interesting for everybody here to see kind of stuff that you're doing here before it's done. So this is the draft, right, of the piece that you're
Yeah.
working on. So you
And a lot of
got
this notation isn't finalized, but it is at least legible in a way that my manuscript paper isn't.
So why don't you describe a little bit of what's going on here for us, and then what I'm going to do is play a bit of it, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And then after that, I want to go into your manuscript materials and see like what was the connection between that, like your conception, right, the manuscript, and then you ending up here. Like how did that process, go for you? But like first of all, like what's happening right here? What are we looking at?
Yeah, so this is that rhythmic melodic idea that I had right as I started developing the piece. This ostinato idea that will bounce around between different sections of the choir. This poem isn't quite like other poems I've worked with in the past for setting poetry to music. It's a bit shorter, and there is not as much there. It's all very evocative, but it just doesn't have as much of an arc. So I had to kind of change my approach to how I was constructing the music, and I chose to focus in on this O day idea and expand it into this running, very energetic ostinato motif that alternates with the text presentation of the kind of just more poetic, more evocative lines of the poem.
So why don't we give everybody a chance to take a listen to this? And one kind of thing that you did here, which was I think something I had suggested, right, is to make the audio piano, right? So this is going to be a piano rendering?
Yeah, this will be piano.
One thing I like to do, this is not something I came up with on my own. The composer, John Mackey, does this a lot. And what he would do is he put all the lines with piano instead of the actual instrument. And personally, I find this very, 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 very good when dealing with choir because like the choir samples are just usually just terrible, especially in Sibelius or Storko or whatever. So the piano samples give you kind of a more like rough idea of what the melody and the harmonies are going to be without being influenced by how crappy the choir sounds are. So this is what we're going to hear here. So let's take a listen. Very cool.
More to
And
come.
what and more to come, exactly. And one thing we didn't mention is the hand clapping and the chest slapping and the stomping, which obviously you have as part of that going on. Cool. I want to talk a little bit about like, okay, so this is kind of like you're doing a draft, obviously in your notation software. It's just one part of the piece, right? But like what are the other facets that are like in front of you as part of your toolbox? Like what else are you using to write the pieces? Just in the notation software? What else are you doing to keep yourself organized here as you're writing? Because I feel like, at least when I'm a couple of minutes in notation software, what I end up tending to do is starting to push play a thousand times, and then I forget, hey, I got another 5 minutes to write or whatever it is. So like how do you deal with that? How do you keep yourself organized?
Well, definitely per your recommendations, your expert guidance, I've been limiting my notation software time, and that has definitely helped me from getting stuck in a playback loop. Right now, my process as it is mostly on paper. All of that material was fully sketched out on paper over the course of several drafts before I put any of it into the notation software. And I'm working on actually incorporating a little more notation software so I don't have to just sit there and play everything on the piano, particularly as the counterpoint gets a little more naughty and not
Mm,
really what the fingers are able to do. Yeah, it's easy, particularly given my background. As I started out writing, I didn't have a lot of instruction on compositional technique. I was just super interested in writing, and my professors encouraged me and helped me learn a lot of theory and a lot of the kind of supplementary elements of composing outside of craft. And I didn't really have a sense of like how I could use different tools to my advantage. So, first off, I was just writing on paper, but just like bar, 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 beginning to
hmm
end. I was like, well, that's the way that the music looks when I see a final score. So I guess that's the way that people write. When I started working in notation software, I kind of started to get around that. I was getting a little more fluid, particularly after switching to Dorico from Finale, which is a nightmare to use, as
Well,
some people may know.
you did that before finale kind of went
Yeah.
belly up, right? You did it.
hmm
You kind of foreshadowed that a little bit there.
Yeah, I was probably one of the last 10,000 people to join it, and then before it had really died, I was like, this doesn't work for me. I switched over to Dorico. I really liked the fluidity of that software and was like, okay, I can generate ideas in this in a way that I simply didn't want to in Finale. And I started being more focused on where do I have an idea? Let's write that first rather than go from beginning, middle to end and get stuck when I can't come up with something next.
Yeah,
And
I mean, you
yeah,
you have like kind of a system for this, and it's interesting because I teach the system, right? I mean, I'm teaching it to you guys. I'm teaching the system, but at the same time, you have to take the system and craft it for your own self, right? It's not a
absolutely.
it sort of is almost a one size fits all system, at least in my view and the way I've seen it happen. I mean, I'm sure you can probably attest to this too. But there is a once you've kind of got that system down, there is wiggle room, which is what you're describing, like being
Yeah.
more in the notation software for certain things, like counterpoint, the contrapuntal stuff you're talking about. You have to first be entrenched in the system to know that part, right? It's kind of like you have to trust it before you do those things, which is what you're kind of alluding to.
Absolutely. I think the strength of kind of your teaching method is that you show a toolbox and you show a way of using it that is, your way and it works for you and it has been very effective. And that makes a good starting point for how other people can use that toolbox. But it is a toolbox, so everyone can kind of figure out their own preferred ways of doing that are probably going to be a little bit different one to the other.
Absolutely. Yeah. Otherwise, it takes the magic out of it a little bit if you're just
hmm
doing it rogue. But there is no, well, let's take a look here what you did so that we can see what we mean by this. So I found this really interesting because you mapped out, is this like what would be the first, so let me just show everybody what these pages are. So you have like literally words on a page, first of all. Then
hmm
you have manuscript paper. this is my, patented, well, it's not mine, but the one I tell everybody to get carton number 27, this humongous piece of paper that you wrote on, and you have a couple pages of it there. I think you might have had a few more, right? But I think these are just the two
Hmm.
you're showing for today.
Yeah.
So can you describe like what you did? Like, what was your strategy? Did you have the poem first? Did you know that you're going to write for choir first? Did you start here for like what, like, can you tell us like in what order you did certain things?
Yeah.
And did you do that intentionally or did it happen in a conscious way? Like, what did you do exactly to get to
Hmm.
this point so far?
I started out knowing I was going to write for choir, specifically a choir in my area, the choir at the high school that I went to. I knew that I wanted to work with them. I checked with their director, and they said they'd be happy to do something that I wrote for them. And after that, knowing the choir, knowing kind of their skill set, I went looking for poems that I thought, I could buy into and the high school choir could buy into. I found that poem and then spent some time with it and kind of looked at the different, you know, puzzle pieces inside the poem, and mapped out an outline, a structural outline, from there. This is actually a second draft of that outline with some more specific details. So I started out pretty minimal. I was like, I want this section that repeats this text, and then
Okay.
I want something different.
So you did start with like something like this, some draft of
Yeah.
this.
Hmm.
So you got like rhythmic. So can you describe what's going on like here, this first bit over here?
Yeah, and that's the first part that we listened to. So that shows kind of the flow from the first little section into the second section that we heard. We start out the piece with this rhythmic ostinato in the alto, and then the background parts fill in the soprano, tenor, bass. And after that, there's a little bit of a
Let's see.
transition. Yeah.
Let's see how that translates. So you have alto. Yep. Like you said, there's an alto line. And then, yep, like you said, the soprano, the tenor, and the bass, they come in later as a background. So it's like interesting because like when you write it out, you're not just writing out what you want to do, which is interesting. You're also writing out everything you're not going to do and be
Yeah.
distracted by. Because
Hmm.
like if I'm being honest, right? Like after this page, one can really do anything. I mean, literally, you can have,
Hmm.
right, like you can have this O'Day thing be harmonized with tenors and basses. You can repeat it again, but harmonize it. You can just have the soprano sing it alone, if you want. You can have O'Day, and then have a soprano do O'Day, and then tenor O'Day, and then you can do this like contrapunct. Like there is like another 100 things I could probably list, right? But you said no, I want to do this and then this, and that's my A section, which I think
Hmm.
is very, very, is a very disciplined thing to decide to do because you're putting your focus on what's the best version of that idea I can do. Because something I think that at least that happens to me is that I write something and then I'm thinking, oh wait, what are the other what are 10 possibilities, right? It's like, well, no, I already decided, hey, this is the possibility I want to try. Let me try that first and let me see if it's something I like. If it's something you don't like, fine, do something else. But let me at least focus in on my initial thought, right? My initial thought process. And that's what you did here,
Yeah.
which is interesting. Like, correct me if I'm wrong here.
No, that's
But
totally right. I've definitely found, as I have delved more into composition, having that structure from the start helps me get through the piece, helps me get over that hump of, well, is this, exactly what it could be? I think two things that have helped me with that is knowing I have a plan already and it makes sense. And also accepting the fact that the piece isn't done until it's done. And, if I really end up not liking something, I can just go back and change it, like you said. But I don't have to change it before I see how it fits into the broader whole.
right, like giving yourself I think also it's a confidence issue too. Like we feel I think there's two things going on which you're dealing with exceptionally well. The first part is we as composers, myself included, a lot of us have confidence issues. It's like,
Hmm.
well, I don't know enough stuff. I don't know enough theory. I don't know enough counterpoint. I don't know enough of the canon. to write something new. Like, who am I to write something new when there's Brahms and all these people around, right? So all of us are dealing with that, even the best composers out there. And then there's that second part of it where you have what I call shiny object syndrome, where you have this idea you really like, you want to pair it with a bunch of other ideas that you really like, without focusing on that one object that's going to take you from A to B. And those two things are the hardest part about writing, in my opinion, getting over those two things, because those two things never go away. They just don't go away. You have to like constantly fight against it, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And I just find this method that you're doing here interesting because it kind of distracts you in a way from those outside influences. Because it's really easy to sit there and be like, why the hell am I doing this? Like Eric Whitacre already has a bunch of, Mort
Mm-hmm.
Lordson's already, they're gonna play all that stuff with or without me. You know what? But you're doing it anyway because you're enjoying the process of it, which I find fascinating looking from the outside in. We don't have time to go through all of this. I don't know how
Yeah.
interesting that is either, but just that A section that you pointed out at the top there, is there a correlation between like what's the correlation between this and this?
Yeah, this is an example of something we talked about earlier, how I've seen my process develop with vocal music, is starting with rhythm first. So I think that is the next step I took, that page that we're looking at now. Everything here looks like notes, but it's actually mostly a focus on rhythm. I wanted to figure out where things were happening rhythmically because I consider the text to be so important to how a choral or vocal piece comes across. So I had a general idea of contour. I had contours that I thought were going to work. And like you can see there that that contour basically matches what's in the notation software version. Um, but really the main focus was what is the kind of rhythmic profile, rhythmic language that we're existing in, and just mapping out how the parts are going to overlap with one another so that, the text doesn't get obscured, the text doesn't end up happening in awkward places in the meter, all of that.
So like when you're writing this, let me get this straight. Because I see pitches here, right? And I see slurring, I see text, I even see bar lines. So when you say you did the rhythm first, what do you actually mean by that? Because I see notes, I see pitches, I see bar lines, I see a lot of information. Actually, I see a lot of information here at
Mm-hmm.
one time. The only thing I don't see actually is the dynamics. That's the only thing I don't see. Actually, this has a lot of information. So when you say you did the rhythmic profile first, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, all of the notes are placeholders. All of the bar lines are suggestions rather than strict things. And the slurs here are just syllabic slurs, which are done a lot in vocal music, um, just to emphasize the fact that a note is, or a syllable is being sung through multiple
Hmm.
notes. Taking a one step back from what you see on this page, I started developing the ostinato idea on its own first, just writing out a rhythm for the ostinato and seeing, how can I tweak this? How can I take, the kind of hazy initial idea I have in my head, put it onto paper, see what I like about it, see what I wish it did, and then experiment with ways of kind of amplifying the characteristics that I wanted to have more of.
Interesting. Okay. So you wrote the rhythm out. It might have sounded like da 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 ba da 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 ba da ba da ba da da ba da ba da ba da ba, something like this. No
Hmm.
pitches, no nothing.
Yeah.
Or maybe there was even a version, sub A of that,
Hmm.
perhaps. And then you decide, okay, that's my rhythm. What are the parts of that rhythm I want to highlight? And I'm assuming that's how you decided, like, what's like the high pitch. So like here you have O day, you have the O day, O, and that third note is the highest pitch there. It's a B
Hmm.
flat. So
Yeah.
is that what you mean by like characteristic? Like you wanted to highlight that third pitch? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I was thinking initially about rhythmic profile elements that I wanted to emphasize, and that third note is what I ended up making a lot of the focus. I wanted this rhythmic line to emphasize 16th note anticipations of
Hmm.
the beat. And that is something that you see a couple other times throughout the ultimate 4-bar ostinato. I didn't even, I don't think, consciously think, hey, how am I going to line this up with then the melody that gets applied to this set of rhythms? But definitely I heard that third rhythm as being something different, a different note to match with the rhythm and really emphasize it, draw your attention to it.
It's just interesting hearing you talk about this stuff. It's so detailed. Like every decision is so detail oriented. But when you hear it, it doesn't sound like that. At least in my experience, it boggles people's minds a little bit that, to create music that kind of sounds effortless, it actually takes a lot of effort to do it.
Yeah,
There is like that,
absolutely.
yeah, there are these decisions that have to be made, but the order that you're making the decisions in, which seem almost effortless, let's say, because you're doing it step by step and you're not going crazy in between each step.
Each small decision builds up over time. You have your core idea, what you start out thinking, hey, this is kind of the general thing that I want to accomplish, with this piece, whatever that might be. And if you kind of build all of your musical elements in the piece to complement that central idea, then you can, I think, much more easily make something that really hangs together as a finished piece.
Yeah, that's really well said. I want to play one more piece of yours, actually. It's a piece called Water Lilies for soprano and piano, right? I'm just going to go ahead and play the whole thing. It's going to be a MIDI rendering, but you're going to be able to hear and see basically what the piece is all about. So let's take a listen to it. Water Lilies. think I'm pretty sure this is the first piece that we worked on together, right? This is the first piece that
Yeah,
you actually
this
like
is
started and finished.
this was a something I started in I think September. So start to finish, I was working on this with you and kind of refining my process and my ideas with your help.
Yeah. I want to know, like, for everybody listening, especially if you're listening up to this point, but what would be, especially after working on this piece we just heard, right? Because it was your first kind of like introduction to a method for working on composition. Because like what you're highlighting in undergrad, my undergrad experience is very similar. It's very music theory heavy, counterpoint heavy, orchestration heavy. And the idea of composition as like a workflow kind of gets ignored. I don't know how you were, but I mean, I had a lot of really great teachers. It was interesting. None of them wanted to kind of impose, they were very careful to impose how they actually literally compose. They had a lot of really great philosophies about composing. They were really good with identifying specific things that one was doing in a piece, right? But there was never like a workflow. The closest I ever got to that actually was when I studied with John Corigliano at Juilliard. Remember the very first lesson that we had, he sat me down and said, okay, this is how one can generate a form. I thought, oh, this is cool. I get to see how he actually makes the sausage, right? But that was basically it. He just showed me, okay, this is how I do it in one of my pieces. Here's the timeline. He drew a timeline that kind of looks like this. He puts a line here, 1 through 15 minutes or whatever, and he has all these different colored pencils showing the different instrumentations and so on. And I've been using that ever since. But but then the act of, okay, what happens after that? When you're actually writing down, etc., writing music on the paper. Do you even use the paper today? Is it antiquated? Do you use a DAW? Do you sing into a microphone? Do you write in a notation? Like, what are you supposed to freaking do after that? My whole tantrum, I guess, my soapbox here is, I guess, two things from you I'd like to know. Number one, what would be probably the number one thing you've learned, especially writing that piece that we just heard, because it was your kind of your first introduction to a method. The second thing I'd like to know is like, what are you hoping to do next? Not so much career stuff, because even myself, I don't even know what the hell I'm doing next, right? But what do you want to do? Like, what do you really want to do as far as your composition journey goes? So
Yeah.
the two big questions.
hmm Biggest takeaway from that piece, starting off with that part of it, is the idea of separating out different musical parameters and working on them independently. That's not something, not an idea I had been exposed to before. It's something I had tried, but never in kind of a I'm fully aware of what I'm doing way. It was always just like, well, I like this chord progression, so I'm going to map that to the piece as a whole. But that'd be kind of it. And then everything else would be, you know, starting out as a composer, I'd be like, well, I have the chord progression and now da 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 da, beginning to end, here I go. All of the music at once. Thinking about different musical parameters as separate entities that can be played with independently, overlaid onto one another, but ultimately kind of exist separately from one another was a really big takeaway from this piece. So, working with a rhythmic profile for the singer first without any reference to notes, and then separately from that, thinking about a pitch set to apply to those rhythms, but that also exists independently of that pitch set and can be used elsewhere in the piece. Taking that melodic pitch set and considering how to use that as a harmonic series, a harmonic set for the piece,
Mhm.
ways of applying those notes into the harmonic language of the piece. Yeah, and there I think you can already see, what we were talking about earlier of you have a central idea, how can you build out the kind of supporting elements of the music to complement that central idea?
Yeah, and you definitely were doing that with this piece. I love this idea of separation. It's almost like separation of church and state, separation of
hmm
rhythm and melody, separation of melody and
Absolutely.
harmony, separation
hmm
of timbre and melody, and treating them as treating them separately, but with the goal, obviously, of putting them all together. Because
Yeah.
when the idea, right, when we're hearing a piece like this, is that you didn't compose them separately, right? If we hear it as four separate things, we almost, unless that was your intention, I mean, we almost fail as composers because
Hmm.
we're trying to create one sing, at least in my view, when we're composing music, what you're really doing is creating a singular experience. A person can only hear this piece by Theodore Schwamm in this guise in this way, right? That's a singular experience that you're creating. But ironically, to create that singular experience, you need to be cutting and chopping your process into tiny bite-sized pieces.
Hmm.
And that's the thing that I think we as composers, and not just composers, but artists in general, you see a painting that's finished in front of you, and you're so focused on that end result. The fact is, 99% of our work has very little to do with what happens at the end, right? Like that last note that you put in the double bar line, that's like a less than 1% of your process, you know? But to everybody else, that's 100%
Yeah.
of the process, right? Because that's what they hear or what they see in a score. So just getting you getting over that was very interesting for me to see. And I guess the second part of the question, I forget. Oh yeah, what would be the next like compositional hurdle? I suppose you'd like to get over now or get over next.
Yeah, I think my main focus is after I wrap up these next couple of choral pieces that I'm working on, things that I am going to have the chance to have premiered in my local community. I'm going to try and go back to the basics. Studying voice, I have found it to be true again and again that I think I understand something, and then suddenly my teacher says something in a slightly different way, and it totally reframes how I view that element of singing. And it's always basic things. It's never like how you should like shift your formant to sing an E flat 4. It's like what does it mean for you to have your breath support engaged? Really basic questions in singing that I'm sure I'm going to have some parallel discoveries in composition by going back to the basics. And what I mean for that in my case is working with solo instruments. It's never
Mhm.
something I really did. Right when I was starting out, I wrote one solo cello piece, and I think that is the only like instrumental solo I've ever written. I just got interested in writing for larger ensembles, choirs and chamber ensembles, and never spent more time with solo instruments. And I think having the chance to look at how do I write music that's compelling, that just has one instrument, one line, and, the set of timbres exclusive to this one instrument. I think it's going to be a really interesting challenge for me. And, the nice thing too is that as a young composer, I don't necessarily have access to a lot of musicians who would, be willing or able to play my music, but the barrier for entry is as low as it can be if it's one player.
Right.
I'm yeah, I'm looking forward to that, and I'm hoping that it will mean I get to, collaborate with more performers in my area.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you posting about, if I can just share your post here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just remember that you posted, so I went and searched for it in the group. The thing I love about this post is you put it out there. Hey, I'm going to be writing a bunch of solo study pieces, right? Like what you just
Hmm.
mentioned, short solo study pieces. So that was 23 days ago, right? So
Yeah.
the interesting thing is, if 6 months go by and you haven't written one yet, it's like, all right, Theodore, you said you're going to do it.
Time's a ticking. And now,
Here it
I'm
is.
talking about it on a podcast too, so the whole internet is going to know.
Exactly. But like you said, the barrier to entry is low with a solo piece, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't take as long to write. It's not as hard to find somebody to play it. And the beautiful thing about writing solo music, that I think is very, very, very underutilized, is that when you get connected with a player, right? The reality is you don't get like you're a good example of that. You're connected into your vocal, kind of the vocal scene in your area, right? And you're a vocalist yourself, you know a lot of vocalists. So that is kind of relatively easy. But what about violin?
Hmm.
It gets a little more tricky. But the thing is that once you get past that friction of meeting one good violin player, what ends up happening? That violin player will know
Yeah,
other violin players.
I know all the vocalists in town. They know all the violinists.
Exactly. So it's about cutting that first barrier. Okay, one violinist. Okay, I do a good job with that violinist. That violinist will tell the other violinist, "Oh, there's this composer. Yeah, I had a great time working with him. And the piece was really good too." And then a little bit of noise, a little bit of buzz will start. The funny thing is that when you start this kind of momentum, the other, let's say violinists, to use this example, you'd be surprised. They don't know as many composers as you think they know. So often I meet a group, even professional group of musicians, that they've never met a living composer before.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that they met me and they liked my music, it's like, well, we already met him, we like him, we like the music. Let's just go ahead and go with him. Why sit there and listen to 100 pieces
Yeah.
that could be equally as good or better than his piece when we already know him and like him and want to do the piece, right? So that kind of mindset shift is really paramount, I think, for a composer.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fact that you are going in with the mentality of writing for solo, right, rather than string quartet or orchestra especially. I mean, that's the Achilles heel when it comes to teaching composers, getting them to not write for orchestra first, right? But yeah, this mentality, I think, is a long-term view. The nice thing about it is you get like some instant gratification along the way. Because writing an orchestra piece and then having it sit on the shelf for God knows how long is the worst feeling in the world. I know how that feels, even though I get a
Mm-hmm.
lot of my stuff played.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, I know, composition is something, it just takes time to like build kind of your name in the musical spaces that you're in. It's not something that happens overnight for really anyone. And certainly, when you were bringing up that hypothetical violinist talking to their violin friends, the way you said it, I think, is totally accurate. I liked working with them, and the music was good. Honestly,
right.
if they like working with you and the piece was even just decent, it doesn't have to be their favorite piece. If they think that you are, someone who treats musicians well and isn't just, being nasty for no reason. I think the kind of pleasant to work with factor is super important, and it's not something that you necessarily see change your interactions with people immediately, but it definitely is the type of thing that builds up over time.
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly right. And pleasant to work with maybe is a too cliche thing to say, but at least genuine to work with.
Hmm.
Because you can have this, I've seen it happen, and I've done it myself, where you have genuine disagreement. Doesn't mean you don't have disagreement,
Yeah.
arguments, and which I've had with players before. Doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes you have to stand your ground. But it's that the genuine interaction with a player, with a performer, with a conductor. That is obviously, respectful. Obviously, there's always that part of it, but it's important to stay genuine to yourself in the process, right? You're not just doing it because you want a gig or you want to,
Hmm.
meet, you know, 10 cellists, like,
Hmm.
that's not the right way to go. And you're not going to have fun doing it either. It's gonna you lose all your joy from doing that. So, but you already know that. So, absolutely. Great, Theodore. Any last things you wanna mention about any of these pieces or your journey so far, before we wrap this up?
I've been out of college now for about 9 months, and I knew I wanted to spend some time this year, independently working on developing my composing. Wasn't sure exactly what that would look like. And, working with such an excellent teacher and having the chance to really dive into my like technique, and that thing that I was, kind of missing in my college experience. I've seen so much growth in kind of my music and the enjoyment of the process that I have that I didn't expect to see. If I could talk to myself from 9 months ago, I would be, very pleasantly surprised. The last thing I'll say is just a year can change a lot.
That's a good point.
Hmm.
That's a good point. I remember that I had the same thought when I was at Juilliard. I went into Juilliard first semester, and I remember pieces that I wrote before going there and the pieces that I wrote after and the pieces I wrote a year into it. It's just it's amazing how and it's probably and of course part of it was going to Juilliard for sure, but also part of it was I remember how goddamn hard I worked in that year. And you're doing the same thing. So it's a combination not just of the teaching. The teaching has to be there, of course, the good teaching, but also on your part, your motivation to actually do the work and to follow through and to be accountable. And one last piece that I will add to this, to give you your flowers here, is the community aspect. Because one thing, I'm not going to say at which instance because I've been to three, so you can kind of throw a dart and probably guess which ones I'm talking about. But I remember one of these three institutions in particular had a very, very strong sense of community in terms of composers. I remember composers actively helping each other with the various projects they're working on. I would remember some composers would actually conduct other people's works, or they would play in other people's works, give feedback on other people's works. And I remember feeling like, actually, this is half of it. The learning is the community aspect. And you've been amazing in that, helping other people on their journeys and not just worrying about yourself. I think it's very commendable. So I wanted to add that little piece too that you've done. I don't know if you were like that before, but I'm assuming you were, right? But that's a really important piece of this puzzle, right? Because being a composer is not just being a hermit, right?
Hmm.
That's the romantic view of it. That's when we
Hmm.
watch what's that movie, Amadeus or
Yeah.
Immortal Beloved, that movie with the Gary Oldman. That's not what a composer is today. I don't, and I'm not sure if that was ever what a composer was, to be honest, in the past. So
Hmm.
anyway, thank you, Theodore, for coming on,
You're
and
welcome. Glad to
we'll
be here.
chat soon.